The chandeliers sparkled as my son slammed his fist on the table. "Dad is just a bum. Don't think you'll get a penny. Go away." The laughter died down. My relatives looked at me like I was a bum. My hands were shaking until the lawyer cleared his throat, lifted a sealed envelope, and changed everything. Before we get into the reasons why this happened, if you believe karma always finds a way, please subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. My name is Thomas Whitaker, and I have lived long enough to know that love can lift a man and grind him down to dust. 72 winters behind me, a lifetime of grease under my nails, and a promise to my late wife pressed like a fingerprint on my heart. Take care of our boy, no matter what. I ran a modest auto shop on the edge of town. Nothing shiny, nothing loud, just steady work and honest hours. I fixed what was broken: carburetors, timing belts, men's pride after a bad decision behind the wheel. The shop paid our bills, kept food on the table, and piece by piece built a bridge for my son to cross into a better life. Brian used to sit on a wooden stool in the corner, kicking his heels, watching me turn wrenches. "My dad can fix anything," he'd brag to anyone who'd listen. I wore those words like a medal, so I said yes to everything he needed. Tuition? I worked late, then later. First home? I emptied savings for the down payment. Wedding costs that swelled like summer storm clouds. I sold my vintage Chevrolet, the one I rebuilt, bolt by bolt, the one Margaret loved to ride in on Sunday mornings. I watched it disappear down the street and told myself the truth every father knows. Sometimes you let your favorite things go so your favorite person can rise. Then life shifted quietly at first. Brian married into wealth, and money walked into our family like a stranger who refused to take off his shoes. Gratitude faded. Jokes sharpened. At dinners, he spoke louder, laughed harder, glanced at me the way people glance at a stain on a clean shirt. The room would chuckle small, polite, while I folded my hands in my lap and told myself he was just nervous, just trying to fit in with people who speak in investments and vacations. I wanted to be proud. I tried. But pride got heavier each time he said "Dad" like an apology. Each time relatives looked at me with that soft, embarrassed pity, as if I had wandered in from the cold, as if I did not help buy the roof above their heads. I kept my mouth shut. I kept my promise. I kept breathing through the ache, because a father endures until the day endurance becomes its own betrayal. And that day was coming, closer than any of them knew. The change came like rust, slow, creeping, easy to ignore at first. After Brian married into money, he began to carry himself with a new swagger. Expensive suits, words polished like silver, and every glance toward me carried something sharp, something that made me feel smaller than the man I once was. It began with jokes. Light, harmless, that's what everyone said. At dinners, he'd raise his glass and laugh. "Careful, Dad, don't spill on that old jacket." They don't make antiques like that anymore. The table would erupt in laughter. My face would burn as I tugged at the sleeves Margaret had mended more than once. I laughed too, because what else could I do? But the sound stuck in my throat like broken glass. Another time, he bragged to his in-laws. "My dad's simple. He doesn't understand stocks or real business, but I take care of him." He said it with a smile, but the words felt like a verdict. Heads around the table nodded, and I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, wishing I could vanish into the wallpaper. I told myself he was nervous, trying to impress. I told myself it was nothing. Margaret's voice haunted me. Take care of our boy, no matter what. So I swallowed my pride and let him step on it. I convinced myself endurance was love, that silence was strength. But the silence weighed heavier each day. Each laugh at my expense cut deeper. Each nod of agreement from relatives carved a mark into me. They didn't see the nights I bent my back for his tuition, the vintage car I sold for his wedding, the years I lost caring for him. They only saw what he wanted them to see. An old man clinging to scraps, a burden at his son's table. And though I stayed quiet, deep inside, something was shifting. The patience that once kept me steady was hardening into something else. Not anger, not yet, but a knowing, a cold understanding that my own son had begun to treat me as though I no longer belonged in the very life I built for him. Thanksgiving should have tasted like home turkey, gravy, the soft hush of gratitude, but that year it tasted like metal. Brian carved the bird with a grin too wide, performing for his in-laws. "Dad," he said, voice bright enough to sting, "try not to drop anything. We just had these floors done." A chuckle rolled around the table. I tightened my grip on the plate until my knuckles went white. I ate slowly, old jaws, careful teeth, and he leaned in, whispering loud enough for the room to hear. "You always take forever. We'll be here until morning." Laughter again. I smiled something small, something practiced, then set down my fork and listened to the sound of my own breath, steady as a metronome, the only rhythm I could control. By Christmas, the tree glittered like a store display. My house, smelled of cinnamon and money. Brian stood with his arm around his wife, telling her parents how he was covering me. "It's what good sons do," he said. "I make sure he's comfortable." Heads nodded approval, polished with wine. No one asked how tuition was paid, how a down payment materialized, how wedding bills disappeared. No one asked what it cost to sell the car that held my best years. They preferred the simpler story, the rich son, the poor old man. Relatives started repeating his lines, handing them back to me like folded napkins. "You're lucky to have Brian," one aunt said. "He's really stepped up." I looked at the mantel, at the framed photo of Margaret in her Sunday dress, and a memory rose like steam, her whisper in the kitchen. "Take care of our boy." I had. God knows I had. In the evenings I wandered the hall like a guest searching for the exit. Voices dimmed when I entered. Conversations clipped. I learned the choreography of invisibility, how to drift between rooms, how to become useful without being seen. Coats on hangers, plates carried to the sink, smiles that cost nothing and bought me a little peace. Then came the quiet humiliations that only families can perfect. A missing place card, a chair nudged to the end of the table, my glass refilled last. None of it large enough to name, each one small enough to deny. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself the season made everyone tense. I told myself too many stories. One night I woke to laughter in the living room, Brian and his friends talking in the glow of the tree. "He means well," Brian said, "but he's stuck in another era." They laughed softly, like they were being merciful. I stood in the hallway, bathrobe wrapped tight, and felt the house tilt beneath my feet. The same walls I had painted, the same roof I had helped replace after a storm. My hands had built this life board by board, dollar by dollar, and still, I was the stranger in it. I kept quiet. I kept folding the corners of my hurt until it fit in the pocket of my sweater. I told myself patience was dignity, but dignity frays when it rubs against contempt. It thins, until one more careless word can tear it clean through. That word was coming, and when it finally arrived under chandeliers and bright laughter, I would learn what breaks a father is not the insult itself, but the chorus of silence that follows. Margaret's memory was supposed to be sacred, but even that Brian managed to tarnish. When she fell ill, I had stood by her side through every hour, hospital visits, bills piling up, nights spent working late shifts just to cover another round of treatments. My back ached, my eyes burned, but I never once thought of walking away. She was my wife, my anchor, the reason I kept breathing. Brian, though, he treated her sickness like an inconvenience. I still remember him snapping, "Dad, how much longer are you going to waste money on this? She's not getting better." My heart stopped. Waste? That word hung in the air like poison. I wanted to grab him by the collar, shake the arrogance out of him, but Margaret's weak hand squeezed mine from her bed. Her eyes told me, "Don't fight. Endure." So I swallowed the rage, burying it so deep it nearly choked me. When she passed, the house felt colder. Her laugh no longer filled the kitchen. Her footsteps no longer softened the hall. And in that silence, Brian grew louder. He rolled his eyes when I lit candles for her, muttered about how I was living in the past. Relatives began echoing his tone, treating me as though I were fragile, dependent, less than whole without him. They believed his version of things, that he was the strong one, the provider. Not me, but I remembered the truth. Every late-night shift, every dollar scraped together, every sacrifice Margaret and I made so Brian could rise. My son may have forgotten. The relatives may have believed his story, but Margaret's eyes, fading yet fierce, were burned into my memory, reminding me of the promise I made. Take care of our boy. I had kept that promise. But each time he dismissed her memory, each time he treated my devotion as weakness, I felt the promise twist into chains around my chest, and somewhere inside I began to wonder if protecting him had come at the cost of betraying myself and her. The night of the dinner, the chandeliers burned like little suns, reflected in polished glass and the silver that never remembered my hands. The room hummed with laughter, forks chimed against porcelain, and I sat at the far end of the table, half shadow, half rumor, pretending not to hear the jokes that used to be about weather, and now were about me. Brian was holding court, shoulders squared, wedding band flashing when he gestured, voice bright as a showroom. He told a story about a generous son who let his father stay in his home out of kindness. The table loved it, heads bowed with admiration, smiles stretched. I pressed my napkin flat with both palms and counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3, like I was tightening lug nuts in the right order so nothing would come loose and kill someone on the road. Aunt Lila leaned over to a cousin and said, "Just loud enough." "It's a blessing," Brian stepped up. "Not every child would." I pretended to reach for water. My hand shook. The pitcher rang softly against the glass, an accidental bell before a funeral. "Dad," Brian called down the table, his grin ablaze. "Why don't you say a few words? Maybe thank everyone for supporting you." The silence that followed was the cruelest kind, a hush that invited shame to take a seat beside me. My throat went dry. I looked at the faces I had fed on holidays, the roof I had helped pay for, and I felt something thin inside me begin to tear. I stood, slowly, carefully. The room watched an old man rise. My knees argued, my back protested, but my voice when it came was steady. "Dinner looks lovely," I said. "Thank you for having me." That was all. Saturday. The relief on their faces was a soft laugh they didn't let out. Brian didn't like that I didn't give him a stage. His smile tightened. He tapped his glass once, twice, and then his hand came down flat on the table with a sound like a door slamming. The room jumped. "Let's be honest," he said. "This arrangement can't go on. My father he's a burden. He doesn't contribute. And he needs to leave. Tonight we make that clear." The word burden rolled across the table like a slow spill, touching plates, touching hands, touching me last. I watched it sink into the linen. Somewhere behind my ribs, an old engine seized. I felt every eye on me, measuring, deciding. I placed my trembling hands under the tablecloth and squeezed until the shake turned into a steady burn. My mouth tasted of pennies. For a heartbeat, I thought I might apologize impossible habit just to save them from their discomfort. Old men learn to shrink so others can sit comfortably. I almost did it. But then Margaret. The shape of her smile in the reflection of my water glass. The way she used to look at me when I came in from the shop, tired but proud. The promise I made at her bedside, knuckles white around her fingers. Take care of our boy, I had. God help me, I had. "Brian," I said softly. My voice surprised me. "Calm, clean. This house has a history you don't understand." He laughed quick, nervous. "What history? Paperwork says what it says." He snapped his fingers at one of his in-laws. "We've talked about transferring things, haven't we?" At the far end of the table, a chair scraped. The lawyer, quiet all evening, polite as a shadow, cleared his throat. He set his napkin down with painstaking care, reached into his briefcase, and lifted a thick sealed envelope that caught the chandelier light. Conversations died. The room froze between breaths. The lawyer met my eyes steady, professional, unafraid, and then he spoke to the table. "Before any decisions are announced," he said, voice even as a level, "there is a document that must be read." Brian blinked. "What document?" The envelope rested on the tablecloth like a drawn line. I watched the wax seal, the neat handwriting I knew by heart, and felt the shake leave my hands, as if a storm had finally exhausted itself against the shore. Everything went quiet, dishes, clocks, lungs, and in that quiet, I knew the truth was finally on its way. After that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, memories started spilling back into me, memories I had buried under years of grease, sweat, and sacrifice. My life hadn't been about chasing riches or building an empire. My life had been about one thing, Brian, and everything I gave up to make sure he had the future Margaret and I dreamed for him. I remembered the moment the chance came to expand my repair shop. A partner had offered me a loan, a second location downtown, more employees, more profit. It was the kind of opportunity men wait their whole lives for. But Brian was just starting high school, and Margaret had whispered to me that he needed me home more. He was struggling with his classes, drifting without guidance. I looked at the papers, the figures, the promise of more money, more pride, and I set the folder aside. I told my partner no. I told myself my boy needed me more than I needed ambition. Nights followed where I sat at the kitchen table, bills spread like puzzle pieces, Margaret across from me with tired eyes. "We'll manage," I always said, and we did. Somehow, but the shop stayed small, and the dream of something larger faded like paint in the Sunday. What did Brian remember of those years? Probably nothing but the warm meals on his plate and the new sneakers he wore to school. He didn't see me counting coins in the dark, didn't hear the silence of a man watching opportunity slip through his fingers. He just saw the door open, the lights on, the world steady. That's the way of fathers, isn't it? We bury what we could have been so our children can become what they should be. I thought, back then, that he would carry that knowledge with him, that he would honor it one day. I thought he would see the sacrifices stitched into the fabric of his life. But lying there after the dinner, with his words still echoing burden, I realized he had forgotten it all. Or worse, he had never cared to see it, and that hurt more than any insult shouted across a table. The day I sold the Chevrolet felt like cutting a good memory out of my own life. That car wasn't just metal and paint, it was Sundays with Margaret, her scarf fluttering in the wind, the radio humming something soft while our hands met on the bench seat. I rebuilt that machine bolt by bolt, piece by piece, like a prayer you say with your hands. It gleamed because I had polished it with time I did not have. But weddings are expensive the way fires are hungry. There is always one more thing to feed. The venue, the flowers, the band, the suits. I did the math 3 times and it still didn't work. So I folded the keys into my palm and drove the Chevrolet to a man who had always asked if I would sell. He shook my hand before he counted the cash. He knew what he was taking from me. I knew what I was giving. On the way there, I took the long route, past the river and the old brick mill, letting the gears climb and settle the way a chest breathes. Every street carried a season of our marriage. Every turn brought back a laugh, a fight, a promise. I parked it in his driveway and sat for one last minute with the engine ticking, little sounds like a clock finishing a sentence. When I came home without it, the driveway looked wider, emptier. I stood there with my hands, suddenly useless. Margaret came out with 2 mugs of tea and pressed one into my palm. She didn't say, "Are you sure?" She said, "You're a good father." And I believed her, because believing her was the only way to keep moving. Brian barely looked up when I told him the money would cover the band and the photographer. "Great," he said, scrolling his phone. "It'll be a night to remember." A night to remember. The words landed like a receipt proof of purchase, no gratitude required. On the wedding day, he stood under white lights and promised forever to his bride. I watched from the second row, the way fathers do, smiling until the muscles ache. When the toasts began, he raised his glass and said, "Everything I've built, I built myself." People cheered like he had won a race. I clapped too. What else could I do? A father does not ruin his son's night with the truth. Later, after the music and the confetti, I walked out into the parking lot alone and stared at rows of cars that were not mine. I could have named every engine by sound, but I could not find the one that had carried my best years. The night air was sweet with flowers and spilled champagne. I took a deep breath and told myself the same line I always used when something hurt more than I could admit. It's only a thing. It's only money. It's only time. But it wasn't only. It was youth I would never touch again. It was Sundays that would not return. It was a sacrifice wrapped in ribbon and handed, quietly, to a son who thought gifts fell from the sky. I went home on foot, slowly counting the streetlights like beads. When I reached the porch, Margaret had left the lamp on. I stood in that small circle of light and tried to feel proud. I tried to feel full. The truth was simpler and sharper. I felt hollow, and I told no one. When Margaret got sick, the world seemed to fold in on itself. Hospitals became our second home, bleached hallways, machines that hummed like broken prayers, bills that arrived faster than paychecks. I worked the shop during the day, then drove across town for night shifts, patching engines under flickering lights just to buy her one more week, one more chance at comfort. My body aged twice as fast during those years. My knees swelled, my back screamed every time I bent, my hands shook from exhaustion. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. If suffering could be traded like currency, I was willing to spend every ounce of mine. I wanted Margaret to wake up and see sunlight through the window without fear. I wanted Brian to walk into her room and see hope instead of despair. But Brian rarely came. He was always busy studying, networking, building his future. When he did show up, he carried impatience in his shoulders, glancing at his watch, sighing when the nurse adjusted Margaret's 4. "Once," he muttered, "Dad, how long are you going to keep pouring money into this? She's not getting better." The words hit me harder than any debt collector ever could. I felt the air leave my lungs. Margaret squeezed my hand weakly from the bed, her eyes begging me not to lash out. I swallowed the fire, I told myself he was young, afraid, not ready to watch his mother fade. But deep down, I knew it wasn't fear. It was inconvenience. Those nights, after leaving the hospital, I would drive past the shop just to see its dark windows. The place looked like me, tired, worn, still standing out of habit. I would park, rest my head on the steering wheel, and pray for the strength to keep my promise. Take care of our boy, Margaret had said. Even as she withered, she trusted me with that. So I bore it all, the debt, the exhaustion, the heartbreak, because I thought one day Brian would understand what it had cost. But he never asked. He never wanted to know. And when Margaret finally slipped away, I buried her with the last of my strength, wondering if my silence had raised a man who believed sacrifice was worthless. The last week of Margaret's life was quiet, too quiet. The machines softened their beeping as if they were apologizing for the noise they had made in our home. Light fell across her face in thin bands that reminded me of Sunday mornings in the Chevrolet, of wind and coffee and a life that felt wider than any road. I sat beside her bed and counted her breaths the way I used to count lug nuts carefully, afraid that if I lost track, something essential would come loose. On the final evening, she opened her eyes and found me. Not the old man I had become, but the boy she married, the one who promised more than he had, the one who meant every word. Her hand was light as paper in mine. "Tom," she whispered, the sound as small as a prayer, "take care of our boy." She paused, gathering what little strength remained. "But do not let him take you." I nodded, because that is what husbands do when the person they love most says the thing they fear the most. I told her I would. I lied. A little. I would take care of him. I had built my whole life around that. But not let him take me? I didn't know how to stop giving. I had trained my hands to open. When the nurse shut off the machines, the room did not fall silent. It fell honest. There was no more rhythm to pretend at. I pressed my forehead to Margaret's palm and thanked her for every ordinary day she had made miraculous. Then I went home to a house that echoed like a church after the congregation has left holy, empty, impossible. In the weeks after the funeral, the promise hardened around my ribs like a cast. Friends brought casseroles. Relatives brought advice. Brian brought plans. "You can move into the spare room," he said, already scrolling his phone for furniture. "It'll be easier. I'll manage your bills." His voice was brisk, competent. There was no room in it for the way I grieved, slow, stubborn, private. I tried to honor both halves of Margaret's instruction. I cooked for Brian on weeknights, fixed the things he broke without noticing. When his faucet dripped, I replaced the washer. When his car rattled, I crawled under it with a flashlight and tightened what was loose. I did it all quietly because grief teaches you how to move through rooms without disturbing the air. But the second half, "do not let him take you," kept snagging on my days. He took my time with errands that turned into hours. He took my dignity with jokes that wore the mask of affection. He took my story, telling people I depended on him. Every time I tried to correct the record, the words turned to ash in my mouth. My promise to Margaret sat on my tongue like a coin I couldn't spend. One afternoon, I found her scarf at the back of the closet, thin, blue, smelling faintly of the perfume she wore on the night we danced in the kitchen to a song whose name I can't remember. I wrapped it around my wrist like a bandage and stood at the sink until the water ran cold. "Take care of our boy, but do not let him take you." The sentence repeated until it separated into two roads. I had walked the first for decades. The second, I had never even stepped onto it. That was the day I understood a truth I had been avoiding. Keeping a promise can become a kind of betrayal if the promise is used by others to break you. I loved my son. I would always love him. But love without a spine turns into something ugly, something that lets cruelty pass for honesty and contempt pass for care. So I made a smaller promise to myself, one she would recognize by the shape of it. I would not shout. I would not beg. I would not perform my pain for anyone's comfort. I would keep watching, keep listening, and when the right moment came, I would stand the way a tree stands, quiet, rooted, impossible to move. And beneath that, a seed I barely let myself feel. The first tremor of a decision that would change everything. Brian's wedding was supposed to be a celebration, but for me, it felt like another quiet burial. Not of a person this time, but of recognition, of truth, of gratitude. The lights glowed golden, the music floated, and every guest smiled as if the world had been built for that one perfect evening. I sat in the second row, my best suit pressed, Margaret's absence hanging heavier than the chandeliers above. I had paid for more of that night than anyone there would ever know. Half the venue costs, the flowers, even the tuxedo Brian wore, were traced back to sacrifices that lived in my bones. But no one mentioned it. They never do. Fathers aren't supposed to. Fathers are supposed to fade into the background, nodding like they agree that their pockets are endless. When the speeches began, I braced myself. I thought maybe, just maybe, he would look my way, raise his glass, and say something simple. "Thank you, Dad." 2 words. Nothing fancy. Just enough to let me breathe. But instead, he stood tall, voice carrying across the room, and declared, "Everything I've built, I built myself." No one gave me a thing. The applause hit me like a slap. People cheered, glasses clinked, even the bandleader nodded with admiration. I clapped too because what else can a father do? My palms stung with every strike, as if I was punishing myself for hoping. I glanced at the empty chair beside me where Margaret should have been. In my mind, I saw her hand slide into mine, felt her whisper, "Do not let him take you," but he already had. With those words, in front of everyone, he erased me. He rewrote his story without the man who carried him through every season of his life. After the reception, I walked alone through the parking lot. The night smelled of champagne and roses. Laughter spilled out of the doors behind me. But I couldn't make myself turn back. My feet carried me slowly, like they were dragging all the years I had lost. I stopped by a row of cars, none of them mine anymore, and felt the hollow where the Chevrolet used to sit in my life. A hollow Brian never even noticed. I tilted my head back, staring at the stars blurred by city lights. My chest ached, not from age but from invisibility. For a moment, I wanted to shout the truth, to let the whole world know what had been given and taken. But the words stayed locked inside. My voice, it seemed, belonged to everyone but me. So I whispered to the night instead, "One day, Margaret, one day he will know." And I walked on, carrying silence like a cross, unsure if it would ever turn into something else. The distance didn't happen all at once. It grew like frost on a window, thin at first, then a pattern, then a sheet you couldn't see through. Relatives who used to call on Sundays started texting instead. Then they stopped texting. At gatherings, conversations broke apart when I stepped close, like birds startled off a wire. I told myself it was my imagination, but imagination doesn't leave you standing alone with a full plate and nowhere to sit. Aunt Lila began to speak to me the way people speak to toddlers and strangers, slow, careful, with a smile that never met her eyes. "You're lucky to have Brian," she'd say, patting my elbow. "He's taking such good care of you." Good care. I tasted the words and found them stale. No one asked about the years I took care of him, the mortgage payments I made when interest rates bit, or the tuition checks that bled me in neat, rectangular amounts. History, it seems, only counts when the rich are telling it. At church, the ushers saved me a seat in the back, as if they were doing me a favor. One Sunday, a deacon pressed a pamphlet into my hand about assisted living nice places with lakes and walking paths and friendly nurses who would remind me to take pills I did not need. "Just information," he said. I nodded, folded it twice, and slipped it into my coat pocket where it cut the lining like a blade. The story traveled faster than I did. The old man who lived on his son's generosity. At the grocery store, a neighbor offered to pay for my milk. "Brian told us not to worry if you forget your wallet," she whispered. I paid cash, exact change, and left the cart in the parking lot because my hands were shaking too hard to push it back. I learned new maneuvers, how to time my entrance so I didn't interrupt, how to thank people for kindnesses I had not asked for, how to be the kind of quiet that makes others comfortable. There's a trick to vanishing while remaining in the room you fold your edges in. You round yourself off. You agree with the version of you they prefer. One evening, I overheard Brian on the phone in the next room. He's fine," he said. "I cover his bills. He'd be lost without me." Lost. The word knocked something loose inside me. Not anger, something colder. The kind of cold that clarifies. I stared at the framed photos on the hallway wall. Birthdays, graduations, the shop on the day I hung the sign with my name, and I saw how easily a life can be rewritten when the person who wrote the first draft refuses to speak. That night I stood in the kitchen with the lights off, listening to the house breathe. My house, the cabinets I installed, the sink I tightened after a leak, the floorboards that creaked in exactly the same places they had creaked since I carried Brian down the hallway after he fell asleep in the car. These were not memories, they were receipts. I took out a small notebook from the junk drawer, the one with half-used pages where I wrote part numbers and oil weights. I began to list what I remembered, not to prove anything to them, to prove it to myself. Tuition, 4 years. Down payment, 1 house. Wedding, 1 night that cost a decade. Hospital bills, month after month. Time, youth, dignity tallied in lines and ellipses. I wrote until my hand cramped, and a calm I had not felt in years settled over me. The frost on the window had done its work. I could no longer see in or out. But there is a moment, right before you scrape a window clean, when you admit what has happened. You do not pretend warmth where there is none. You name the cold, and then you reach for the tool that clears it. I did not yet know the shape of that tool, but I could feel it near, inevitable, as if it had been waiting in the house the whole time, tucked away by someone who knew I would need it. When the weight of silence grew too heavy, I went to the only place where my voice still felt heard, Margaret's grave. The cemetery sat on a hill, quiet except for the wind combing through the grass. I carried a folding chair in one hand and a bouquet in the other, walking the gravel path like a man retracing steps he already knew by heart. I set the chair down by her stone and lowered myself slowly, my knees complaining, my back stiff. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the air, the birds, the world moving on without us. Then I spoke, because speaking to her was the only way I remembered how to be honest. "They've forgotten, Margaret," I said, voice rough. "Every late shift, every dollar, every piece of us we traded so Brian could stand tall, they look at me and see a man who takes, not a man who gave. He tells them I'm his burden, and they believe him. Dant first and the Grask." The stone said nothing, but I could see her eyes in my mind, steady and kind. I imagined her shaking her head the way she used to when Brian was young and selfish, half frustration, half love. I felt the sting of tears, hot and uninvited. "I promised you I'd take care of our boy. I have. God knows I have. But in doing that, I think I've let him strip away everything that was me, and I don't know how much of me is left." I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the cool granite. The chill grounded me. "But I won't let them erase you, or me. I won't let your memory be turned into some story he twists for applause. You deserved better. So did we." I pulled a notebook from my coat pocket, the one I had started filling with the list of sacrifices. Tuition, mortgage, wedding, hospital, hours, years. I read it aloud, line by line, letting the words hang in the air like proof. With every item, the ache inside me shifted into something sharper, something that cut but also carved. Resolve. When I finished, the sun was lowering, painting her name in gold. I closed the notebook and whispered, "I'll protect what's ours, even if it means standing alone." As I rose to leave, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of her perfume from memory. For the first time in years, I felt the promise I made to her, not as a chain, but as armor. And though the world still saw me as silent, invisible, erased, I walked down that hill knowing this truth. I had not been forgotten. Not by her. And soon, not by him. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that sneaks up on you when you think life has already shown its teeth. I was sorting through Margaret's belongings, boxes stacked in the corner of the bedroom. Dust settled like quiet judgment over everything. I hadn't had the heart to open them since the funeral. But that day, something in me insisted. Maybe it was her voice. Maybe it was the ache in my chest that refused to fade. I lifted old dresses that still carried her perfume, letters folded neatly in envelopes, photos yellowed at the edges. Every item felt like both a wound and a gift. Then, at the bottom of a box, beneath a stack of recipe cards, I found an envelope thicker, heavier than the rest. My name was written across the front in Margaret's careful hand. My breath caught. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the envelope trembling in my fingers. I broke the seal and unfolded the papers inside. Legal pages, signatures, stamps. And at the top, Last Will and Testament of Margaret Whittaker. I read slowly, carefully, as if each line were a step on a bridge that might collapse beneath me. It was all there, the house, the shared savings, everything, and every word placed it in my name, protected under law, notarized and witnessed, ironclad, clear, unquestionable. I felt the air shift around me. My heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with something colder, steadier. Margaret had known. She had seen the cracks forming long before I admitted them. She had left me more than memories. She had left me a shield. Her voice returned to me, not from memory this time, but from between the lines of those pages. "You always give too much, Tom. I won't let him take everything." I set the papers on my lap and stared at the sunlight spilling across the floorboards. For the first time in years, The weight pressing on my chest loosened. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't living at my son's mercy. The truth was in my hands, signed and sealed. Brian thought he had rewritten the story. But Margaret had written the final chapter before she left, and she had written it for me. Holding that will in my hands, I felt Margaret closer than I had in years. The ink was her foresight, the signatures her final act of love. As I traced her name at the bottom of the page, a memory rose up, clear as daylight, the day she told me why she wanted this done. It was 2 years before she passed. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the smell of coffee and motor oil filling the air like it always did. She had been quiet all morning, stirring sugar into her cup until it dissolved. Finally, she looked at me with that steady gaze she used when she had already made a decision. "Tom," she said softly, "you give too much." I laughed it off. "That's what fathers do. That's what husbands do." She reached across the table and pressed her hand against mine, the same way she used to when Brian was little and we were worried about money. But her eyes were sharper this time. "One day, he's going to forget. He won't mean to at first, but then it will be easier for him to believe the story that leaves you out. And you'll let him, because you think love means carrying the weight alone." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. Brian was my son, our son. He wouldn't, I said. Not Brian, but Margaret only squeezed my hand tighter. "I know you, Tom. You'd rather break your own back than let him stumble. But I won't let him take everything from you. Not the house, not the savings, not the life we built together." That week she went to the lawyer. I remember waiting in the truck outside the office, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, still convinced she was overreacting. When she came back, she carried the folder with the same calm determination she carried everything. She didn't gloat, she didn't explain. She just said, "One day, you'll understand why." Now, sitting on the edge of our empty bed with her will in my lap, I finally did. She had known. She had seen the storm coming, and she had built me a shelter before it ever broke. The next morning, I carried the will into town, tucked inside an old leather folder that smelled faintly of the shop. My palms sweated the whole walk to the lawyer's office, though I kept telling myself there was no reason to be nervous. Still, a part of me feared it might not be enough, that maybe Brian could twist even this, that the world would side with him the way it always seemed to. The lawyer was a steady man, silver-haired, glasses perched low on his nose. He spread the papers across his desk, reading line by line, tapping each page with the blunt end of his pen. The room was quiet except for the rustle of paper and the thud of my heartbeat in my ears. When he finally looked up, his eyes were calm but certain. "This is airtight," he said. "Witnessed, notarized, legally binding. No court would question it. The property, the savings, it's all yours. Your wife made sure of that." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My shoulders sagged with relief, but beneath it was something stronger, colder like steel being quenched in water. "So if he tries to claim otherwise," the lawyer shook his head, "he has no claim, not now, not ever." I nodded slowly, staring at Margaret's signature at the bottom of the page. The loops of her handwriting looked almost alive, defiant. She had spoken louder in ink than I ever had in person. The lawyer slid the will back into its envelope and folded his hands. "Mr. Whitaker, you don't need to rush, but when the time comes, when you decide, it will stand. Just be patient. The truth always has a way of catching up." I left the office with the envelope under my arm, walking through town as if the ground itself had changed. The same streets, the same faces, but I was not the same man. For years I had been painted as dependent, invisible, erased. But in my hands I carried proof that the story was never his to tell. That night, I placed the envelope in the top drawer of my dresser. I rested my hand on the wood, steadying myself, and whispered, "Thank you, Margaret." For the first time in a long while, I slept without dreaming of shame. In the days that followed, I carried the secret like a live coal in my chest burning, but not yet ready to show. Brian continued as if nothing had changed, strutting through the house, telling stories that painted me smaller, weaker, more dependent than I had ever been. He laughed with his in-laws about covering the old man's bills. He shook his head when I fixed a leaky faucet, saying, "Don't strain yourself, Dad. You'll hurt something." His son there. Every word was another match struck against the stone of my patience. But I stayed quiet, because now I knew silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Every insult, every public jab, was building the stage where the truth would land hardest. At Sunday dinner, Brian made a show of passing me the cheapest cut of meat while he carved the roast for everyone else. "He's used to simple meals," he said, winking at his wife. The table laughed. I chewed slowly, nodding as if I agreed. Inside, though, I felt the will's weight in my pocket like a promise. One day soon, the laughter would stop. When neighbors stopped me on the street to ask if Brian was taking good care of me, I forced a smile and said, "He's doing his best." But in my head, I finished the sentence. "And so am I." Because I was no longer the man being erased. I was the man waiting. At night, I would sit by the dresser, drawer slightly open, the envelope's edge peeking out like a blade in its sheath. I would rest my hand on it and feel Margaret's presence, steady and unyielding. I didn't need to argue with Brian anymore. I didn't need to defend myself to relatives who preferred his version of the story. The truth sat waiting in ink and signatures, sharper than anything I could say. And so I let him talk. I let him laugh. I let him build his tower of lies higher and higher. Because I knew what he didn't. The taller the tower, the harder the fall. One afternoon, I watched Brian from the porch as he gave his in-laws a tour of the house. My house. He walked them through every room like a salesman showing off a property he had earned with his own sweat. "We redid this kitchen last year," he said, running his hand across the counters I had paid for. "The mortgage is manageable. Good thing I'm smart with money." They nodded, impressed. His wife's father clapped him on the back, pride in his eyes. I stood outside, unseen, as if I were part of the landscaping, old, decorative, unnecessary. Later I overheard him in the living room boasting, "This place is ours. Dad just stays here because we let him. One day, we'll renovate, make it truly ours." My chest tightened, but I didn't move. I stayed in the hallway, listening, while my hand brushed the envelope hidden in my pocket. The will was there like a steady heartbeat, reminding me I wasn't the guest in this house. He was. That night, I walked through the rooms alone. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but they were familiar creaks, ones I had known since the day Margaret and I signed the original deed. I touched the walls, the window frames, the staircase rail polished by years of her hand gliding along it. Every corner whispered our history, not his. This wasn't just a house, it was our life built, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Brian thought he could rewrite the story with loud words and borrowed pride. But the truth didn't need volume. It just needed the right moment to be read aloud. And when that moment came, no amount of boasting would protect him. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the space where Margaret used to set my coffee cup. I placed the envelope down, its seal unbroken, and whispered into the quiet, "He doesn't know this house at all." And, the walls seemed to listen, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible inside them. I felt like the rightful owner I had always been. The decision came to me as quietly as breath. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the evening light stretching long shadows across the floor, when I realized patience alone was no longer enough. Truth has a weight it demands to be carried into the open, and I was done letting Brian use silence as his shield. I called the lawyer the next morning. My voice didn't shake, though my hands did as I held the receiver. "It's time," I told him. He didn't ask what I meant. He simply said, "I'll be there. Bring the family together." So I waited. I let Brian plan another of his grand dinners, the kind where he filled the house with relatives and in-laws. Laughter and wine. He loved those nights because they gave him a stage. He didn't know I was setting the stage too. In the days leading up, I prepared in silence. I polished Margaret's picture frame and set it in the center of the mantel, where everyone would see her face. I straightened the dining room chairs, touched up the old wood so it gleamed under the chandelier. This was still our home, and it would witness the truth. I slipped the envelope into the inner pocket of my jacket, close to my heart. Every time I felt its edge, I remembered Margaret's steady voice. "Do not let him take you." At night, I rehearsed nothing. There was no speech to give, no anger left to hurl. All I needed was to wait for Brian's arrogance to peak, because arrogance always does. And when it did, when he finally said the words he could never take back, the lawyer would rise. The envelope would open, and the story he had built would collapse in front of every person he had fooled. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was truth. Clean, undeniable, written in ink and witnessed by law. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to prove. I only needed to endure long enough for the moment to arrive. And God help me. I was ready for it. The night before the dinner, I met the lawyer in his office one last time. His desk was neat, his suit pressed, his expression steady. He placed the envelope on the table between us, the seal unbroken, and tapped it once with his finger. "Are you sure?" he asked. His voice wasn't doubtful, it was respectful, like a man giving me one final chance to turn back. I nodded. For years I've kept quiet. I let him speak for me, about me. But Margaret didn't write this to gather dust. She wrote it to be read. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment. Then tomorrow, when the moment comes, I'll read it word for word. No interruptions, no questions. The law will speak for her, and for you. His certainty steadied me more than anything else could have. I slid the envelope back toward him. "Keep it safe until then." Kless. As I left his office, the night air was crisp, the streets nearly empty. I walked slowly, hands in my pockets, listening to the rhythm of my footsteps. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost moving through my own life. I felt present, anchored, ready. When I got home, I stood in the doorway of the dining room, staring at the long table where it would all unfold. The chandelier hung above like a silent witness, waiting to shine its light on whatever truth entered the room. I pictured Brian at the head, smug and certain. I pictured the relatives nodding along, the in-laws smiling tight, the silence pressing against me like always. And then I pictured the lawyer rising, opening the envelope, and breaking that silence clean in half. Before going to bed, I sat by Margaret's photo on the mantel. "Tomorrow," I whispered to her, my voice steady. "Tomorrow, he'll know. They'll all know." The house creaked softly, almost like it was answering back. I turned out the lights and let the darkness settle around me, not as a weight this time, but as a curtain. And behind that curtain, I waited for the morning. The dinner began like so many others, wine poured, laughter rehearsed, every smile just a little too polished. I sat at my usual place, near the end of the table, where no one had to look at me unless they wanted to. The chandelier glowed overhead, painting gold over silverware and glasses that clinked with cheer. I chewed slowly, quietly, a shadow, at my own table. Brian thrived in these moments. He told stories about work, about deals closed, about trips planned with his wife's family. Every sentence was another brick in the image he built for himself. The successful man, the provider, the one everyone admired. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded in my lap. Silence had become my shield. But tonight it was something more. It was the rope he would use to hang himself. Halfway through the meal, he turned his attention to me. "Dad," he said loudly, his glass raised, "don't drink too fast. We don't want you falling asleep at the table again." Laughter rippled around the room, polite but sharp. I smiled faintly, nodding as if the joke didn't land like a blow. My heart beat steady. I waited. He grew bolder as the wine emptied. "You know," he told his in-laws, "Dad's lucky. Not every son would let their father live with them. But I believe in family." The table murmured approval, forks tapping plates in agreement. My fingers brushed the inside of my jacket where the envelope once rested. Not tonight, I thought. Not yet. Let him keep talking. The lawyer sat at the far end of the table, silent as always, sipping his water, eyes sharp behind his glasses. No one paid him much mind, they never did. But I could feel the weight of his presence like a stone at the center of the table. He knew. I knew. We were both waiting. So I let Brian perform. I let him bask in the applause. Let him cast me as the old man clinging to his kindness. Every word he spoke stacked higher, a tower of arrogance reaching for the ceiling. I kept my head bowed slightly, my smile thin, my silence perfect. Because the higher he climbed, the harder he would fall. And tonight, he was already near the edge. By dessert, the room had warmed with wine and laughter, but beneath it all was the same cold edge I had come to know too well. Brian tapped his spoon against his glass, calling for attention. The chandelier light caught his smile, wide and confident, the kind of smile that expected applause before the words even left his mouth. "Family means honesty," he began, his voice carrying over the table. "And it's time we all faced a truth. My father," he gestured toward me with his glass, "has been living here because I've allowed it, but this can't go on forever. A man should stand on his own, not drag down those around him." The words hit like stones dropped into water, rippling through the faces of our relatives. Some looked away, others nodded faintly. None spoke. My chest tightened, but my face remained calm. I lowered my eyes to the tablecloth, tracing its pattern with my finger, as though I were just an old man too tired to fight. Brian went on, fueled by the silence. This house, it's our future. My wife and I plan to renovate, to build a real legacy for our children. And Dad, he paused, shaking his head with mock sympathy. You'd be happier somewhere smaller, quieter. Maybe a place where you don't have to worry about bills or upkeep. I can arrange it. Arrange it? As though I were cargo to be shipped off, not the man who had poured every ounce of himself into the foundation beneath us. I felt my hands tremble beneath the table, but I kept them hidden, clenching until the shake became a steady burn. The table murmured agreement. A cousin muttered, "It might be for the best." An aunt dabbed her lips with her napkin and avoided my eyes. No one stood for me. No one remembered. They let his words settle like law. Brian leaned back in his chair, satisfied. So tonight, let's make it clear. Dad will be moving out. We'll help him get settled somewhere more suitable. Cass. My fork rested untouched on my plate. I looked at the faces around me, relatives who had eaten meals I paid for, who had laughed in kitchens. I worked myself ragged to keep warm, and I felt something inside me go very still. The time was coming. The silence they mistook for weakness was about to end. The moment hung heavy, the air thick enough to choke on. My relatives kept their eyes fixed on plates, napkins, glasses, anywhere but me. I felt their silence press down like a verdict. Brian's words had become their truth, and I was already half erased in their minds. Then, a sound broke the tension. A slow, deliberate clearing of the throat. It came from the far end of the table. The lawyer set down his fork with precision, as though marking the end of a course. He reached into his briefcase, the motion unhurried, calm, like a man who knew exactly what weight he carried. When his hand emerged, it held the thick envelope sealed with wax. The same envelope Margaret had placed into existence years ago. Conversation stuttered and died. The only sound was the faint clink of glass as someone's hand trembled against their wine. Brian frowned, confused. "What's this?" The lawyer's voice was steady, cutting clean through the room. "Before any decisions are made tonight, there is a document that must be presented." He laid the envelope flat on the tablecloth, its seal catching the chandelier's light. Brian laughed nervously, glancing around at the others for support. "A document? About what?" The lawyer looked directly at me, then back at Brian. "Your mother's last will and testament." The words landed like stones in a pond, sending ripples across every face at the table. Forks paused mid-air. A chair creaked as someone leaned forward. For the first time all evening, all eyes were not on Brian, they were on me. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the mask of silence still on my face. Inside, my chest burned with something steady, something certain. This was the moment Margaret had prepared for, the moment I had waited for. Brian's smile faltered, just a flicker, but enough. "There's no need for that," he said quickly. "We've already discussed what's best for Dad. Let's not complicate things." The lawyer broke the seal with a firm snap. The sound cut sharper than Brian's words ever had. "On the contrary," he said, "it's time for the truth to be read aloud." The lawyer unfolded the pages with deliberate care, as though each crease carried the weight of a lifetime. The room had gone utterly still. Even the clink of cutlery had ceased. The chandelier's light seemed to sharpen, focusing on the words about to be spoken. "In the matter of my estate," the lawyer began, voice firm, "I, Margaret Whittaker, being of sound mind, do hereby declare." His eyes scanned the lines, his voice unwavering. And with every sentence Brian's confidence drained. The will named me by full name, Thomas Whittaker, as the sole beneficiary of the house, the savings, and all marital assets. Every brick, every dollar, every shred of security that Brian thought he could claim belonged, without question, to me. Gasps broke from the table. A cousin dropped her fork. An aunt muttered, "My God." But no one spoke louder than the lawyer, who read on, each line another nail in the coffin of Brian's story. Brian shifted in his seat, color rising in his cheeks. This doesn't change anything," he stammered. "We've already agreed." "No," the lawyer interrupted, his tone as sharp as the snap of the seal. "This document is final, legally binding, and beyond dispute. Your mother was clear. This house and its assets belong solely to Mr. Whittaker. You, Brian Whittaker, have no legal right to them, none whatsoever." The words landed like hammers. My son sat frozen, his mouth half open, his glass trembling in his hand. Around us, relatives whispered, the tide already shifting. The performance he had perfected for years was unraveling in front of their eyes. I sat motionless, my hands folded neatly, my silence no longer a mask but a weapon. For once, I did not need to defend myself. Margaret was speaking for me from beyond the grave, her voice written in ink, carried by the man at the end of the table. The lawyer closed the folder with finality. This is the truth. There is nothing further to discuss. Under tension, the silence that followed was heavier than any insult Brian had ever thrown, and for the first time in years, it was not my silence that shamed me, it was his. The room erupted, not in noise but in shifting currents. Chairs creaked as relatives leaned toward one another, whispering sharp fragments. All along? So it was his? Did Brian know? The same mouths that once laughed at his jokes now formed tight lines of disapproval. The tide was turning, and I didn't have to lift a finger. Brian sat rigid, jaw clenched. His smile collapsed into something brittle. His wife's parents avoided his gaze, their faces stiff with embarrassment. One of his uncles coughed into his napkin, a sound more like judgment than illness. The applause he had once commanded had curdled into silence, into suspicion. I lowered my eyes to my plate, calm as still water. For years, I had endured humiliation in that very room my silence used against me. Tonight, silence belonged to him. Every second stretched longer, heavier, until it pressed down on his shoulders like iron. He tried to speak, words fumbling. There must be some mistake. Maybe the paperwork. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, unbothered. There is no mistake. The will is notarized, witnessed, sealed. Your mother's intentions are indisputable. Mr. Whitaker owns this home, and all associated assets. That has always been the truth. Gasps echoed again, softer this time, tinged with recognition. I could almost hear the math being done in their heads, the stories rearranging themselves to fit reality. The generous son had become in an instant the usurper, and I, the man they had pitied, ignored, erased, was revealed as the rightful pillar holding the family's foundation. Brian's wife shifted uncomfortably in her chair, pulling her hand from his. Her eyes flicked toward me, then quickly away. Shame was contagious, and it had begun to spread. I breathed slowly, deliberately, as if to remind myself this moment was real. My patience, my sacrifices, my silence, they had not been wasted. They had led to this. The truth standing tall while lies crumbled into dust. And across the table, my son sat in ruins of his own making, with no one rushing to lift him back up. The lawyer wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase once more and withdrew a neat stack of documents, each stamped, signed, and bound with clips that gleamed under the chandelier. He laid them out across the table like cards in a game already won. These are certified copies of the will, he said, sliding them toward Brian, then toward the in-laws, then toward the relatives who sat closest. Each one legally valid. There will be no confusion, no dispute, no room for interpretation. Well, the papers spread like wildfire, passed hand to hand, eyes scanning the lines, lips moving as they read the name written clearly, Thomas Whitaker. My name. Again and again. Each repetition was a strike of the hammer, nailing the truth into place. Brian didn't reach for his copy. He sat frozen, fists clenched tight on either side of his plate. His ears flushed red, his jaw stiff. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a boy trapped inside a suit that no longer fit. Relatives who had once nodded along with him now stared with narrowed eyes. Some shook their heads, disgust curling their mouths. Others avoided looking at him at all, as though shame might rub off if they stared too long. One cousin muttered, "All this time?" Another whispered, "He lied to us." The words were hushed, but the judgment was thunderous in its silence. I sat back in my chair, letting the tide wash over him. The documents were more than proof. They were walls he couldn't climb, doors he couldn't force open, locks for which he had no keys. Every escape he might have imagined had been sealed shut by Margaret's foresight. The lawyer gathered the last of the unused copies into his case with the precision of a man closing a storybook. "This matter is concluded," he said, his voice final. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. The ground beneath me was steady again. The house, the legacy, the truth, it was all mine, not by gift or pity, but by right. Across the table, Brian shifted, finally daring to lift his eyes toward me. They were wild, searching, desperate for a way out. But there was none left. He was cornered not by me, not even by the lawyer, but by the truth itself. At last, I lifted my eyes. For years I had kept them lowered, content to let others speak over me, define me, erase me. But now, with the documents spread across the table, and Margaret's voice echoing through the lawyer's words, I found my voice again. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the table. My voice came out steady, calm, sharper than any shout. I was never living off you, Brian. You were living in my house, under my name, on the foundation your mother and I built. Will back to very, who will plans in the Caramage. The words cut through the room, leaving no space for reply. Relatives shifted in their seats, some nodding, some looking away. The truth had been spoken, not in anger, but in the quiet certainty of a man who no longer had anything to prove. Brian's lips parted, but no words came. His chest rose and fell quickly, his eyes darting around the table, searching for an ally. None came, not one. The silence that met him was heavier than 1,000 voices shouting. I straightened slowly, letting the moment stretch, letting him feel the weight of it. My heart did not race, my hands did not shake. For the first time in years, I felt whole, complete. This home was never yours to give or to take, I continued. It was ours, your mother's and mine, and she made sure it would remain that way. Gasps and whispers spread again, but I didn't look at anyone else. My eyes stayed locked on Brian's, holding him there, making him face what he had tried so hard to bury. He opened his mouth once more, but the lawyer cleared his throat softly, a reminder that the matter was already settled. Brian closed it again, sinking back into his chair. The silence stretched, not suffocating me this time, but suffocating him. For years that silence had been my prison. Now it was his. Brian's allies fell away like leaves in a storm. His in-laws, who once laughed at every boast, now sat stiff and pale, their smiles gone. His wife's father cleared his throat, muttered something about misunderstandings, and reached for his coat. His mother-in-law avoided his gaze altogether, focusing instead on the untouched dessert in front of her. Even his wife shifted her chair an inch away, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The relatives who had once praised him now whispered to one another, heads bent close. I caught fragments all this time, lied to us, took advantage. None of them looked at him with admiration anymore. The applause he once commanded had turned into judgment, heavy and undeniable. Brian tried to recover, tried to summon that easy smile, but it faltered under the weight of their stares. "You don't understand," he began, voice cracking. "I was just—" But no one wanted to hear excuses. Not anymore. The story had shifted, the mask torn away. He was no longer the successful son supporting his father. He was the man exposed greedy, entitled, a fraud, propped up on lies. The lawyer closed his briefcase with a snap that echoed through the silence. "The matter is settled," he said firmly. "There is nothing further to discuss." I pushed my chair back and rose slowly, deliberately. My knees ached, but I stood tall. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing me down. I looked around the table at faces that now searched mine with something new, not pity, not disdain, but respect. Brian sat hunched, small in his chair, his eyes darting anywhere but at me. He had built his tower on sand, and now he sat in its ruins, abandoned by the very people he thought were his audience. I let the silence linger, cold and final. Then I said, evenly, "This isn't humiliation, Brian. This is truth. The truth you tried to bury. Thanks for watching." And with that, I turned and walked out of the dining room. The chandelier light glimmered behind me, but I did not look back. I walked out of the dining room with my back straight, my steps slow but steady. The murmur of whispers followed me, but I didn't turn to catch them. For once, I didn't need to. Their voices no longer had the power to shape me. The only sound that mattered was the quiet rhythm of my own feet on the hardwood floor. I paused at the doorway, hand brushing the frame that I had sanded and painted with Margaret all those years ago. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a shadow haunting these halls. I felt present, solid, the rightful owner of every board, every nail, every corner. Behind me, the chandelier's light spilled across the table, casting Brian in its glow, the son who had tried to erase me, now shrinking into silence. I didn't offer him another glance. He had taken enough of my time, my energy, my dignity. Tonight I was done giving. The house seemed to breathe with me as I moved through it, past the kitchen where Margaret used to hum while cooking, past the staircase we had climbed together countless times. Each step forward felt like reclaiming something. I had almost lost pieces of myself, scattered by years of sacrifice and swallowed pride. When I reached the porch, the night air met me like an old friend, cool, steady, honest. I stood there for a moment, letting it wash over me, before stepping fully outside. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses that once cut me now seemed far away, fading behind closed doors. I didn't wait for apologies. I didn't linger for explanations. I left them to their silence, their shifting loyalties, their shame. They could keep all of it. What mattered was that the truth had been spoken, and it belonged to me now. For the first time in years, I felt light not because the weight was gone, but because I had chosen to stop carrying what was never mine to hold. In the days that followed, the phone began to ring. At first it was cousins, their voices careful, measured. "Uncle Tom, we didn't know," they said. "We only believed what Brian told us." Their apologies came wrapped in excuses, as though ignorance were a shield against guilt. Then came the aunts, voices softer, almost pleading. "We should have spoken up. We should have stood by you." Their words reached me, but I let them fall like rain on a roof herd, but never soaking in. They had all made their choices when it mattered. They had all sat silent when my son called me a burden. I answered none of them. The machine collected their words, each message stacking on the one before, until it became a chorus of regret. I would sit by the phone sometimes, listening to it ring, watching the red light blink, and feel nothing but distance. Once, their silence had cut me deep. Now, it only confirmed what I already knew. Loyalty built on convenience isn't loyalty at all. Neighbors, too, began to shift their tone. Where once they whispered about the poor old man living off his son, now they nodded with respect when I passed on the street. Some even stopped to say they admired how I handled myself at the dinner. I thanked them politely, but inside I thought, you admired the ending, but you ignored the years of cruelty that led to it. Respect, it seemed, was as fickle as scorn, and I had no use for either. I didn't need their pity, their apologies, or their praise. I had Margaret's will, her foresight, and my own quiet endurance. That was enough. So I let the phone ring. I let the messages pile. I chose, for once in my life, not to give what was asked of me. And in that small act of refusal, I felt freer than I ever had before. It didn't take long before Brian came knocking. The first time, his voice was loud, almost defiant. "Dad, we need to talk," he called through the door. I stayed in my chair, hands folded, listening to the sound of his fist against the wood. For years I had answered every call, rushed to every need. Not this time. The knocking turned to pounding. "You embarrass me in front of everyone. Do you even understand what you've done?" His anger rolled through the house, but it meant nothing. No answer. No movement. Just silence thick enough to choke on. The next visit, his tone was different. Softer. "Dad, please, we can fix this. We can figure something out." I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, staring at the folded newspaper in front of me. His voice cracked once, like a boy again, but I did not move. He had wanted me invisible. Now I gave him exactly that. Days passed, and he returned again, desperation rising with each attempt. "I didn't mean it like that. You know I didn't." People twisted my words. Lies dripped through the cracks of the door, but I had heard enough lies to recognize their shape. Still, I said nothing. One evening, he shouted, "You owe me!" The words slammed harder than his fist against the frame. Owe him. After all the years, all the sacrifices, all the pieces of myself I had given, he thought I owed him. I closed my eyes, breathed slowly, and let the silence answer for me. Eventually the knocking stopped, the driveway stayed empty, and the house, my house, grew quiet again. For the first time in a long time, that quiet didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. When the noise of Brian's visits finally faded, I carried the will to the cemetery. The path up the hill was lined with brittle leaves, crunching underfoot like brittle echoes of the past. Margaret's grave waited at the top, her name etched into stone, steady and unchanging. I set the envelope gently on the headstone and sat beside it, lowering myself onto the cool grass. For a long while, I just breathed, letting the silence of the hill wrap around me. No laughter, no accusations, no pounding fists, just the wind through the trees and the steady presence of the woman who had seen this end before I ever did. "I kept my promise," I said quietly, tracing her name with my fingertips. "I took care of our boy. I gave him everything we had to give. Maybe too much. Maybe so much that he forgot where it came from." The paper rustled faintly in the breeze, as if answering. I closed my eyes and let her voice rise from memory. "Do not let him take you." "I didn't," I whispered. "Not this time." I read aloud parts of the will, my voice steady, letting each word drift into the open air. It felt less like reading and more like prayer, a litany of truth carved into law. With every line, the weight I had carried seemed to ease, replaced by something cleaner. Not joy, not triumph, just clarity. When the sun dipped lower, I rose carefully and tucked the envelope back into my coat. "You saved me, Margaret," I said. "Even now, you're saving me." That tantelling's to grieve about, with the daffrin's life. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of earth and autumn. I turned toward home, lighter than I had been in years. The promise was no longer a chain. It was a bond honored, a vow kept. Life began to take on a different rhythm, not rushed, not loud, steady. I woke early, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The mornings were mine again. I brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen, the smell filling the air like memory, and sat by the window watching the street come alive. Neighbors walked dogs, children hurried to school, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost drifting among them. I felt rooted. I went back to the shop, not as an owner chasing bills, but as a man returning to a place that had once defined him. The air still smelled of oil and rubber, of hard work and long days. I rolled up my sleeves, wiped the dust off the old tools, and turned the key in the ignition of a car that had been sitting too long. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared like it, too, had been waiting for me. Word got around that I was back in the shop. Neighbors stopped by, some with cars, some just to say they remembered when Brian was a boy playing in the corner. I nodded, fixed what needed fixing, but kept the conversations short. This wasn't about them. It was about me, about remembering that my hands still knew how to build, how to repair, how to make something whole again. In the evenings, I walked the neighborhood. The house lights glowed warm, but I no longer longed for their approval. I passed the grocery store, the church, the diner, all places where whispers used to follow me. Now, if people nodded or smiled, I returned it politely, but inside, I felt something stronger than their recognition. Freedom from it. I understood then that dignity isn't given, it's reclaimed, piece by piece, moment by moment, with every refusal to bend under lies. I had bent long enough. Now, I was standing, and it felt good to stand. The house felt different now. For years, its walls had carried the weight of Brian's voice, his claims, his arrogance. But once the truth was spoken, the silence that followed was no longer heavy, it was peaceful. I walked through each room slowly, touching the door frames, the banister, the windowsills Margaret once polished, until they shone. Every corner carried her memory, not his shadow. I opened the cabinets and found dishes we had bought together, chipped from years of use. I ran my fingers across the dining table, scarred with scratches from countless meals and arguments, and realized it belonged to me again. Not just legally, but in spirit. It was my home, our home, hers and mine, and no amount of boasting could ever erase that. At night, I lit a single candle on the mantel beneath Margaret's photo. The flame flickered, casting soft light across her face, reminding me that she was still here in the ways that mattered. The house no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like sanctuary again. Neighbors passed by and sometimes slowed to look at the porch where I sat in the evenings. Some waved, some whispered. I didn't mind. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was carved into the very foundation of this house, into the will that bore Margaret's name, into the years of sweat and sacrifice that had built every wall. I slept better than I had in decades. No dreams of shame, no echoes of laughter at my expense. Only quiet, the kind of quiet a man earns after a lifetime of storms. This house was never Brian's legacy to claim. It was mine to protect. And now, at last, it was protected. It was weeks later when I saw Brian again. He came to the porch unannounced, shoulders hunched, eyes darting like a man searching for ground that no longer existed. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to sit in my shop, legs swinging, pride in his voice when he said I could fix anything. But the man standing before me now wasn't that boy. He was the one who had tried to erase me. "Dad," he began, voice thin, Can we start over?" I studied him, the silence stretching between us like a drawn line. The old me, the man chained by promises and hope, might have grasped at that line, tried to pull him back. But that man was gone. Margaret's voice was louder in me now than his excuses could ever be. I rose slowly, the porch creaking under my weight, and looked him in the eye. My voice was calm, steady, cold as steel. "This isn't humiliation, Brian. This is the truth you tried to bury. His lips parted, But I didn't wait for words. I stepped past him, down the porch steps, into the open evening air. The sky stretched wide above me, the horizon clear. For the first time in years, I walked without looking back. There was no forgiveness in me, no need for it. What was broken could remain broken. I didn't carry his shame, or his lies, or his need for absolution. I carried only the freedom of a man who had finally laid down a burden that was never his to hold. The house stood behind me, quiet and strong, Margaret's presence woven into its walls. Ahead of me lay the road open, honest, mine. And with each step forward, I knew one thing for certain. I was free.